Wangchuk Shakapba. I'm with the US Tibet Committee. It's the oldest Tibet support group here in the United States. We actually started in 1977. And ever since then, we've been fighting for Tibetan rights. I'll give you a very good example of something that we did in the 70s. Back then, the United States used to stamp, if you were born in Tibet, they used to, and you became an American citizen, they used to stamp your passport born in China. So we said, well, at least before 1959, it was Tibet, it was not China. So we protested, we lobbied the US Congress, and we were able to get the State Department to change the law so that for every Tibetan born in Tibet before 59, it says Lhasa or it says Lhasa Tibet, or it says wherever you were born in Tibet, but it doesn't say China. And that's an important history lesson that the Chinese government tries to muddle with a lot of half-truths or false information, and that is Tibet was a completely independent country before the 1950s. And Tibet had its own army, it had its own court system, it had its own postage, it had its own currency, it had its own government, it had its own borders, it had its own population, and it had its own foreign affairs bureau. And it had relationships with the British, with Sikkim, with Nepal, with Bhutan, and it even had relationships with China. The Chinese had an embassy, what they call a mission, in Lhasa from 1936 until 1949. And then in 49, the communists were threatening to invade, so the Tibetans kicked out the mission. Unfortunately, it did not stop the invasion. The invasion, as everyone knows, occurred. And ever since the 50s, Tibet has been an occupied country. And since that time, there's been over 1 million Tibetans that have died as a result of the Chinese occupation. We've lost nearly all of Tibet's 6,000 monasteries. There have been some monasteries that have been rebuilt after the 1980s, but that was primarily through local donations by Tibetans. There was very little help from the Chinese government. And what we saw in March of 2008 is that the Tibetan resistance is very much alive. Now in 1959, as everyone knows, there was a major rebellion in Tibet throughout the entire country. It actually lasted more than 1 year. And after that rebellion was crushed by the Chinese army, the Chinese government said the Tibetan resistance is dead. Then in 1980s, in the late 80s, there was another uprising in Tibet, not just in Lhasa, but all over Tibet. That was brutally crushed, and many people were put in jail, and many people were killed. And the Chinese said, the Tibetan resistance is now dead. And then in March 2008, we had another uprising. So is the Tibetan resistance dead? No! Will it go on forever? Yes! Now, after the March protests happened, there's some very good facts that we need to all remember, to keep remembering. When the Chinese started bringing in the paramilitary troops to crush the protests, they shot or killed approximately, at least that we know of, 200 Tibetans. That's the minimum that we know. As you know, information is very difficult to get out of Tibet. They don't allow information in, and they don't allow information out. So a lot of the killings are done in secret. So we suspect the number is probably a lot higher. We also know, and this is from reading the Chinese media, so this is an admission that they're making, that at least they arrested 4,000 Tibetans. That's the very minimum that they arrested, probably more. Out of that, we know that at least 1,000 Tibetans, their whereabouts are unknown. They're still in jail, they haven't been charged with anything, they haven't been released, they're sitting in a prison. There is at least 1,000 people here, if you look around. At least, probably more. So imagine everybody here is in prison. And that's how many Tibetans at least are still in prison in China. And what that means is you have no rights, you don't get a lawyer, you don't get a trial, they sit you in a small jail cell where they can torture you in any number of ways. Some of the tortures are, for example, are taking an electric baton and sticking it in your mouth, or beating you with rubber truncheons. Or one torture I've seen, which they do with the women, a lot of Tibetan women have very long hair and pigtails. They will take the woman and they will take it outside to a tree, and they'll tie her by the top of her head, by her hair, and let her hang there for hours. And they've come up with many, many different ways. After all, it was the Chinese that invented the torture of 1,000 slices, killing somebody by cutting their skin 1,000 times. So These are the things that we all have to remember, that as we are enjoying the freedoms, the luxuries, the privileges that we Tibetans and we immigrants from outside other countries come to the United States, that the Tibetan people and many other people around the world, but indeed the Tibetan people, 6 million of them are suffering. They can't come out and do what they want to do. They can't say what they want to say. They can't raise these flags. Everybody who has a Tibetan flag right here is breaking the law in Tibet and China. You would go to jail just for having this flag. So always remember that these freedoms that you have, and always remember that our fellow Tibetans do not have those freedoms. So it's important for us to stand up, to shout, and fight for those freedoms for our Tibetan people, for our country, and for our independence. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.